and Betty and the Nancys and Bills and Joes and Janes will find in the study of science a richer, more rewarding life.
Hey, welcome to Inquiring Minds. I'm Indre. This is a podcast that explores the space where science and society collide. We want to find out what's true, what's left to discover, and why it matters. Having conversations about the place that science has in society doesn't really make sense if those conversations aren't effective. So, what can we do to improve our communication skills? I was delighted to find the book Supercommunicators cross my desk a few weeks ago, and so excited to talk to the author, whose essays in The New Yorker, I have to say, are among my favorite ways to pass a Sunday. Charles Duhigg is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author of the best-selling book, The Power of Habit. He's a graduate of Harvard's Business School and Yale College and winner of many awards, including from the National Academies of Science. He was also a senior editor at the New York Times and writes, of course, for The New Yorker. Charles, welcome to Inquiring Minds.
Thanks for inviting me on. This is so much fun.
So I want to start actually with the end of your book, because that in some ways really put everything into focus for me. And I want to compare the two lives of, I think it was Camille and Marsden. Am I getting that right? From the long-term Harvard study. So tell us about them.
So the Harvard Study of Adult Development is this kind of interesting project that has been going on for almost 80 years now. And what these researchers at Harvard have done is they've followed people throughout their lives. And initially when this started, the goal was to try and figure out, like, what are the characteristics that make people successful and healthy? And they had all these crazy theories, like, if you came from a good family, because again, this is Harvard, right? In the 1940s, 1930s, if you come from a good family, like you're gonna end up well in life. If you go to Harvard, you're gonna be really healthy as you get older. And as they follow people over years and years and years, and originally they start with Harvard students, and then they expand it to residents of South Boston who are not going to university, and to as people got married, to their families and to their children. What they began to see was that all of these things that they thought would contribute to longevity and to happiness and to success actually didn't seem to correlate very much with those things at all. And as you mentioned, there's these two figures who kind of became emblematic. One of them is someone who enters Harvard basically as like sort of the golden child, right? He's popular, he's smart, he comes from a good family. When the war breaks out, he joins the military and he becomes an officer very, very quickly. And as when he leaves the military, he actually becomes a lawyer. Instead of going into his family's business, he decided to follow his passion into law. And he becomes a very, very successful lawyer, very, very financially successful, very well esteemed within the legal community. But he has very little relationship with his family as he gets older and older and older, because he's working all the time. And then there's another guy. And this other guy, he is like the mirror opposite. He comes to Harvard and he's just completely socially awkward. And he has trouble making friends, and he keeps on going to the infirmary until they tell him they can't come anymore because he's clearly a hypochondriac. He enlists in the military also to fight in the war, but has a completely undistinguished career and basically just doesn't do anything. He becomes a physician, and after he graduates from medical school, he actually attempts suicide, which made him a pariah with the medical community. And so when researchers were following these two individuals, they said, like, look, we know what's going to happen here, right? The lawyer is going to go on to have a successful career, and he's going to be wealthy and happy and successful and healthy as he gets older. And the other guy's basically like a born loser. They like this is someone who might end up killing themselves in midlife. And then for a period that the study stops because they basically run out of funding. And so a number of years, almost 2 decades go by where they don't check in on everyone's life, as they had been doing so for a number of years. And eventually they get funded again. And when they come back and they find these two individuals, what they find is that the lawyer, the very successful one, he is divorced. He's gotten remarried a second time. He says that his marriage is loveless. He says he doesn't have anyone to talk to. He has almost no relationship with his kids. Again, he's very, very professionally successful, but he's miserable and actually very unhealthy, because when we're alone, it tends to affect our health.
Hmm.
And the other guy, this guy who was a loser, this guy had this whole life-changing experience where he got sick. And when he was in the infirmary for 2 years, he basically started playing cards with people and getting to know them, and he started attending um religious events and going to prayer meetings. And when he came out of the infirmary, he decided to restart his medical practice, but this time he was going to focus on allergies. And he builds this whole community around him. And by the time the researchers find him again, he's got this completely rich, completely meaningful community and connections that bring him real joy. And what they find is that it's the second guy, the one who focused on community, that ends up being happier, who ends up being healthier and living longer, who ends up being more successful by his own definition of success than this very accomplished lawyer who has all the money in the world and is just miserable every single day and eventually dies early because his health declines. And they found this again and again and again. And what they found was the really only correlate with whether you're happy and healthy and successful at age 65 is whether you have at least a handful of close relationships at age 45. That without that, it's hard.
And that really kind of resonates with me now too, especially in the context of like Vivek Murthy's, the Surgeon General's kind of claim or sort of entire white paper on the isolation epidemic, that
Yeah.
loneliness is something that is really common in our society. And when I first picked up your book, and I thought, okay, Supercommunicators. I mean, you wrote The Power of Habit, and I was like, okay, this is going to make me more productive. It's going to make me negotiate better. It's going to help me like do all these things. And at the end of the book, I was like, this is actually much more important, I think, in the
Yeah.
things that you're talking about in the book, and less so about just how to have a more productive life, but more about how to have a meaningful life. At least is how
Yeah.
I interpret it.
How to connect with other people. You're exactly right. And being able to communicate gives you those other things, right? Like,
Hmm.
you're not going to be a great manager if you can't communicate well. You're going to have trouble being productive if you can't work with others and but underneath all of that is this question of, what is life supposed to be? And the truth of the matter is that our quality of life, the things that we enjoy the most, that we love the most, that we find the most meaning in, they have to do with connecting with other people. And the way that we often connect with other people is through conversation, right?
Hmm.
That is how we get to know other people, how we share with them who we are. Conversation and communication is the lifeblood of what makes human life worth living. And so
And
you're
I think
exactly right.
I think it's kind of underappreciated, because I feel like we sort of have this sense that the people that you're closest with, people that you have these really meaningful relationships with, should be unconditional. So you should be comfortable sitting in silence with them. And even though I do think that that's true, I think that your point and the way that you lay out these three different or three important conversations that we have, or three types of conversations that we have, and how to do them effectively, really lays the groundwork for then feeling like you can sit in silence and, be comfortable. Um,
Absolutely. It's hard to sit in silence with someone if you've never had a real conversation with them. But if you have had a real conversation with them, then you can sit in silence with each other all the time, right? The silence doesn't feel like a silence. It feels like a pause. It feels like a chance to think before the next great conversation. So you're exactly
yeah.
right.
And I think that was one of the things, like when I was trying to decide whether or not I wanted to marry my current husband. He's also the first Mrs. Viscontis. I remember the one thing that I kept coming back to was that I was never bored in conversation with him. That
Yeah.
there was always something to talk about, and we never ran into this point where like sometimes you have with someone where you literally feel like there's that. It's a very aversive state to be next to someone and feeling like you should be talking to them, but you don't have anything else to say.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Absolutely. And the truth of the matter is that oftentimes when that does happen, it's not the fault of either person. It's because we don't know enough about how communication works,
Mm-hmm.
right? That I could sit you next to anyone and you could have a fascinating conversation with them if you understand how to draw them out, if you understand how to connect with them. And so, there are some people who are just interested in different things than we're interested in, and we shouldn't marry those people, but we can sit next to them for a dinner and probably have a great conversation if we understand how conversation functions.
Yeah. So let's get into that, because I think one of the things, also the points that you make very early on in the book, is that super communicators are not born; they're built over
Yeah.
time as they learn how to do this. So let's maybe the way to move into this is to talk about the three kinds of conversations. Unless you have some, hey, there are a couple of elements that are true to any conversation.
No, the three conversations are really important. And I actually sort of discovered the three conversations when I had this experience that led to me writing the book, which is I would come home from work and I would be talking to my wife and I'd be complaining about my day. And she would offer me some really good advice, like, why don't you take your boss out to lunch or something like that? And instead of being able to hear what she was saying, I would get more upset. And I'd say, no, you're not, you're supposed to be on my side. You're supposed to be supporting me and agreeing that these are terrible people and that they don't recognize how brilliant I am. And then she would get upset because I was attacking her for giving me good advice. And so I went to these researchers and I said, look, I'm a professional communicator. Why do I keep falling into this pattern? Which is a pattern all of us know, right? This happens. All of us have experienced this. And they said, well, look, we're actually living through this golden age of understanding communication. We're this golden age of, because of data collection and because of neural imaging, we can understand what's happening in people's brains as they have a conversation. And the thing that we've discovered is we tend to think of a discussion as being about one thing, right? It's about my day, or it's about my boss, or where to go on vacation next year. But actually, every discussion is made up of different kinds of conversations. And these conversations in general, they fall into one of these three buckets, as you mentioned. So there's these practical conversations where we're solving problems together, we're making plans. But then there's also the second bucket of emotional conversations where I might tell you what I'm feeling, and I don't want you to solve my feelings. I want you to empathize. And then the third bucket are social conversations where we're talking about how we relate to each other in society, the social identities that are important to us. And what they said is, what we figured out is that all three of these kinds of conversations, they're all equally legitimate. They're all equally important. But if you're not having the same conversation at the same moment, it's really hard to hear each other. It's really hard to connect. And so one of the first things that you need to do in order to become a super communicator, and we're all super communicators at one time or another, is you have to take a step back and say, what kind of conversation is happening here? Is this a practical conversation? Is this an emotional conversation? Is this a social conversation? And once you have an answer to that, lean into it, right? Try and match that other person or invite them to match you. That's going to make it much easier for us to become aligned and to connect with each other.
Yeah, and I think when I think about it, especially this is the practical stuff, and that this is how I feel stuff. Like, what is this really about? And how do I feel when people are on opposite sides of those conversations, which I think often happens. And maybe in the description of what this conversation with your wife was like, well, let me solve the problem for you. These are the
she was having a practical conversation, and I was having an emotional conversation.
Yeah,
you're exactly right.
And so that's where things get broken down, and we get into these loops, and then we lose confidence in our conversation partner that they can really give us what it is that we're seeking.
Yeah.
And I like this idea that you mentioned too in the research of kind of neural entrainment. So the fact that we do in this matching way, it's not just that I'm going to match your body language. If you cross your legs, I'm going to cross my legs. And people have sort of talked about that for a number of decades as a tool, an exercise, that people use in interrogation techniques or in conversations where you really want to extract something from someone else. But rather that in a lot of these meaningful conversations, we do have some physiological and maybe even neural matching that happens in terms of the cadence of our brainwaves or our heart rates or et cetera. And that I had never really thought about it that way in terms of the conversation side, because as someone who studies the neuroscience of music, that's really what people talk about music doing. Like, music is really an effective way of communicating because, or connecting people, because it entrains brainwaves, like literally to the to the beat, to the tempo, to the, sound wave itself. And then if you entrain to the sound wave and everyone around you has, then you're entrained to each other. So what do you think are the, like, what role does the neural entrainment play in conversations if it's not, if it's not like in music, there's this external stimulus that you can entrain to that is a little bit clearer? That's kind of what I was wondering. Like, conversation seems to be so dynamic. Like, how does it all work?
Well, so and it's interesting that you mentioned music and that you study because a lot of the folks who are doing the cognitive research right now on conversation come out of the music world for
Mm-hmm.
exactly the reason that you're mentioning, that there's a sort of well-established corpus of literature about how if you and I listen to the same song and we have very similar reactions, we become entrained to each other because we're entrained to the song. But let's talk about what's actually happening there, right? So if I listen to a sad song and you listen to a sad song, we're both experiencing an emotion, this sadness that the music elicits within us. Now, if I tell you a sad story, the reason why it's effective is because, in part, you actually experience my sadness a little bit, right?
Mm-hmm.
If I
Mm-hmm.
describe an idea to you, the reason it feels like we're sharing an idea is because, in part, you're experiencing that idea the same way that I am. So
Hmm.
it's not surprising that our brains would start to look alike, right? If I tell you a story about a time that, a girlfriend broke up with me, you very well, our neural activity will begin to look similar because you're thinking about a time that a boyfriend broke up with you and what that felt
Mm-hmm.
like. We're both experiencing these emotions together. You're right. It's not from an external stimulus, it's from a generated stimulus, but that doesn't actually change the sort of the function of what's occurring. And that entrainment, our brains have evolved to crave that kind of entrainment. And if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense, right? Because Homo sapiens, our superpower is communication. It's the thing
Mm-hmm.
that has made our species so successful. And so, over subsequent generations and eons, our brains have begun to crave have nudged us to crave more and more communication. And the way that it does that is that when we entrain with someone, when we have a conversation with them, when we connect with them, it feels amazing. It feels wonderful. After a great conversation, you feel so good. Your brain is actually releasing neurotransmitters to make you feel that way because historically, your ancestors who craved more connection did better than everyone else. And so that became more and more embedded in our neurology. And so this neural entrainment that occurs is very, very real and very, very meaningful and very much a product of evolution. So we have an instinct to communicate with other folks, to connect with other folks. But if you're having an emotional conversation and I'm having a practical conversation, we're actually using different parts of our brain. It's very,
Mm-hmm.
very hard for us to become entrained because our thinking is not alike. It's very, very
Mm-hmm.
different.
And also, though, when let's say we are both recognizing that we're having a how do you feel conversation and we want to
Yeah.
lean into that emotion, one of the things that I was told as I was going through, like, I think it was called like trauma informed interview technique. So you're interviewing
Mhm.
somebody who's gone through a traumatic event, and one of the things that they say explicitly is, do not tell them about your traumatic event when
Right.
asking them about theirs. And it at the time felt very counterintuitive, because my instinct is, you tell me about your traumatic event and I'm going to empathize with you by telling you about my traumatic event, and so then we'll connect. And so I wanted to ask your thoughts about, obviously we understand that, like, in some ways when I tell you about my traumatic event after you've told me yours, there's a sense that I'm not really listening to you. I'm just waiting for my opportunity to speak, right?
Yeah. So the way that I think about it is this, because there are some times that you tell me something and I'm going to tell you something about myself and it's going to bring us closer together. If you say like, I grew up in a small town in Iowa, and I say, oh, I grew up in a small town in Albuquerque. It feels like we're listening to each other, right? It feels like we're
Mhm.
trying to we're finding things that we share. But if you say, my aunt passed away last week, and I say, oh, I understand. I had a dog that passed away 7 years ago, and I still think about them. That does not feel like I am sharing, right? It does not feel like
Mhm.
I'm listening. So, what's the difference there? The question is, when I share something with you or what I say next, is it trying to enhance the spotlight on what you've brought up, or is it trying to steal the spotlight?
Mm-hmm.
So if somebody brings up trauma and they're talking about their experiences, and I say, oh, here's a traumatic experience I've had, I'm not adding to your spotlight. I'm trying to steal the spotlight away from you.
Mm-hmm.
But if, for instance, I was to say, oh gosh, that sounds really hard, and I know how hard that can be. Tell me a little bit, like, how did you feel after that thing happened? Like what I'm doing is I'm actually accenting your spotlight.
Hmm.
And I'm not saying like I don't want to talk about this. I'm not saying like I don't understand what you're saying. I'm saying I actually empathize with you, and I want to hear more about what you're describing to me. And that act of empathy, maybe even saying like, I've been through some difficult times myself, and I found that afterwards I saw them differently than at the time. Can you tell me about like did that happen with you? Like, do you feel like with retrospect, you see this event a little bit differently than when you were experiencing it? I am actually sharing something about myself, right? But
Mm-hmm.
what I'm doing is I'm not trying to steal the spotlight for myself. I'm not trying to say like, now that I've listened to your story, you got to listen to my story. What I'm
Mm-hmm.
saying is I want to show you that I'm listening and I understand and I empathize, and I'm going to lean in to encouraging you to tell me more about what happened to you. That's a lot of this has to do with kind of like, but there are times when like you grew up in Iowa, I grew up in Albuquerque, that bringing up my own background actually does help share the spotlight
Mm-hmm.
between the two of us.
One of the anecdotes you write in your book is I think it was when you were attending your father's funeral and you wanted to talk about the things that you were experiencing, and most people who came didn't want to talk about it. And
Yeah.
that really resonated with me, because I feel like a lot of times in those kinds of situations it's difficult to know what to say to the grieving person, and yet there's also, I think it's interesting too to watch people who like, and I think this is true in any kind of emotional conversation as it begins. Like, some people just aren't prepared to have that emotional journey with you in that moment.
Absolutely.
Maybe they need to
And,
hold it together or whatever.
and people often say like, I don't know what to say to someone after they say, oh, last week I was at my dad's funeral.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I'll say is it's important in those moments to recognize the distinction between an invitation and a mandate. Right?
Hmm.
So if you say to someone, hey, like, if someone brings up something hard that they've gone through, let's set aside a funeral, but just, you know, if they say, oh, I was laid off from work last week,
Mm-hmm.
and you say, oh, yeah, like, what does that feel like? Like, what are you going to do next? Are you worried about the future? I'm mandating that you talk
Mm-hmm.
about this experience.
Right.
But if I say to you, oh, that's interesting. Like, I'm sorry to hear that. Like, um, what are you excited about? Like, what on the horizon? Like, are you looking forward to now that you have this freedom? I'm inviting you to share with me. And you might very well say like, actually, I'm just trying to get like my head straight. Like, I'm trying to deal with like the aftermath of getting laid off. I'm not really excited about anything. That's totally
Mm-hmm.
fine.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But you might also say, I actually always wanted to go to culinary school, and now I feel like I have an opportunity to do so. So the difference between a mandate and an invitation is very important in those situations,
Mm-hmm.
because I want to invite you to tell me something about yourself, but I don't want to force you to tell me if you're not ready. And one of the easiest ways we can do this is through deep questions that ask people about their values or their beliefs or their experiences, which is as simple as if somebody says, what do you do for a living? I'm a doctor, saying, oh, what made you decide to go to medical school? When I ask that question, I'm inviting them to tell me something about who they are, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm not mandating that they
Hmm.
have to tell me something deeply personal.
Right. Yeah. And I love this concept of the deep questions, because I feel like they, putting it into that framework, it actually kind of gives us a tool when we feel like, okay, the conversation is at this superficial level and I want to get beyond that. How do I do that? Asking someone a question about values, beliefs, and experiences seems like the way in.
Yeah.
Whereas sometimes I feel like, yeah, it's like we get lost in figuring out what to ask next.
Well, and I think an easy way to think about it is our instinct is often to ask about the facts of someone's life. Oh,
Mm-hmm.
where'd you grow up? Where do you
Mm-hmm.
live? Where did you work? Where do you work? But if we ask people how they feel about their lives, it's much more fertile territory. What was it like? What did you love about where you grew up?
Mm-hmm.
Wh- how did you decide to do your job? Like, how did you decide to take that job? How did you decide to become an X or a Y or a Z? When we ask people to talk about how they feel about their lives, what we're really doing is we're creating much more space for them to tell us about who they are, what they want to talk about, and how they see the world.
Yeah. So that kind of brings us to also the hard questions that you have this chapter in your book that sort of describes an incident at Netflix that for me was
Yeah.
very vivid, and also just the whole Netflix culture ultimately, and how that affects the communication that happens within people who work for Netflix under those conditions. So that kind of gets us into this third type of question, which is the who are we question about our values and or I guess our social status, social structure. Well, why don't you
Yeah.
first?
Yeah. Or how we relate to each other in
Hmm.
society and the social identities that are important to us. And
Yeah,
so
social identities. Yeah.
yeah. And I think what's important about that. So there's a couple of things. So how do we have hard conversations? And so what happened at Netflix, just to sort of set the stage, is there was an executive at Netflix who in a meeting used the N word. And obviously he was fired for doing so. But it set off this whole internal controversy about race at Netflix, and it sort of revealed that there was a lot of very difficult feelings and very difficult conversations that people had been avoiding about race and about status within Netflix. And the company had to figure out how to have those conversations. And there's a couple of things that when we have a hard conversation, whether it's about social issues like race or justice or sexual orientation or politics, or whether it's just a hard conversation like, I need to give you some feedback on your performance, and that's going to be a tough conversation, or we're discussing plans and I know you and I disagree about what we ought to do next. There's a couple of things to keep in mind. One of them is it's really important in those situations to show people that you're listening. So there's a technique for this that they teach at Harvard and Stanford and a bunch of other sort of fancy places called looping for understanding. And it has 3 steps. The first is that if you're having a hard conversation, what you should do is start by asking a question, preferably a deep question, right? Preferably a question that invites the other person to talk about what they care about and how they see the world. Then step number 2 is once they've answered that question, repeat back in your own words what you heard them say. And what's important here is not to mimic them, but
Hmm.
rather to show them that you are paying attention, to show them that you're processing what they had to say. And then step number 3, and this is the one we always forget, is ask if you got it right.
Hmm.
And the reason why that's important is because one of 2 things can happen. Number 1, someone might say, no, I don't think you totally understood what I was saying, which is useful, right? To know
Mm-hmm.
that we missed something. But the second and more likely thing that will happen is that they'll say, yeah, no, I think you understood what I was saying. And when we ask if we got it right, what we're actually doing is we're asking for permission to acknowledge that we were listening.
Hmm.
So, one of the things that we know is that if I believe you are listening to me, I become more likely to listen to you. So, for difficult
Hmm.
conversations, proving that we're listening is critical.
Hmm.
Now, let's say we got into the Netflix situation, right? Where it's not just a difficult conversation, it's a social conversation. We're talking about politics and race and how we relate to each other. And is this company fair? One of the things that's really, really easy in a situation like that is to focus on just one social identity, right? To say, like, you're black and I'm white, or you're Jewish and I'm Catholic, or you're a man and I'm a woman. The truth of the matter is, nobody is just one identity,
Mm-hmm.
right? You
Mm-hmm.
might be black, but you're also a parent and a lawyer and a coworker and a manager, and we both coach Little League together. And all those different hats that you wear give you slightly different perspectives on whatever we're talking about. And when I acknowledge that multitude, when I invite them to the table and I say, look, you are these 10 or 12 people. And so I'm wondering, as a Black father who's a lawyer, who has to think about managing your employees, and you also coach Little League, how do you see this issue of policing? Because I'm sure you see it from a different perspective in so many different ways.
Hmm.
What I'm doing is, instead of pushing you into a corner where I say, oh, you're the Black person at the table, tell me what you think about policing, I'm inviting you to share with me how you actually see the world, because all of us are complex.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really, really powerful. That's what Netflix did. And it ended up making all the difference in the world.
And one of the ways in which this can go awry, not this particular way of doing it, but those hard conversations, as you read in the book, is this sense, or is what can happen where someone feels like you are lumping them into a social identity that they don't value. So, for example, if you're arguing with your wife, you can potentially lump her into, well, you just want to fix my problems. You're not or I don't know how to,
Yeah.
like there's a yeah, and I think that that's underappreciated, that sometimes when we have conversations and we react to them in these ways, like we can say things that then makes the other person get on the defensive.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's oftentimes because we're pushing them into one identity, right? Because I'm saying, oh, you're the person who like doesn't listen to my problems. You're the person who becomes too emotional. You're the person who XYZ.
Mhm.
Nobody wants to be in that group, particularly if that group is the only group that we're focusing on. So
Mhm.
when we expand it, when we say like, look, you're someone who I know cares deeply about your relationships with your sisters and with our kids. And I know that you think a lot about, um, how to be a good effective communicator with me. And I know that you're a manager at work and you think a lot about communicating with your direct reports. All of a
Hmm.
sudden, I'm inviting you to explain who you are, as opposed to pushing you into a corner and pushing you into a box.
And sometimes, as I've been reading the book and thinking about this, you're giving us a lot of useful tools to make us better communicators. But sometimes we have to communicate with people who are not, who are interrupting us, who are not listening, who are kind of making all the faux pas that you kind of outline that you're teaching us better communicators to avoid. What tools do you think people should engage with in those kinds of conversations where they feel like the other person is actually committing a lot of the transgressions that you've now shown are really
Yeah.
kind of ineffective communication tools?
So okay, so I think it's worth defining what a super communicator is, and there's a really easy way to do this, which is, so if you were having a bad day and you came home and you wanted to call someone who you just know would make you feel better, just talking to them would really like lift your spirits. Do you know who that person is? Like, does that person pop into your mind?
Yeah.
Who is it?
Well, it's a friend of mine who just always seems to make me feel better. She always just seems to know, like, exactly what I need in the moment,
Yeah.
in a non-judgmental way. Yeah.
So okay, so she's a super communicator for you, and you're probably a super communicator back to her. And there are some people who can do this consistently, right? There's some people who recognize that that's a set of skills that she has, and they can do it with anyone. So let me ask a little bit about her. What's her name?
Her name is Diana.
Okay, Diana. So when you call Diana, what is she actually doing? Like, what does she do that makes you feel better?
She if I think about it for a minute, she uh she I guess she asks questions that I feel I want to answer, as opposed to questions that I don't want to answer. I don't know if that
Hmm.
makes sense. Like, she'll ask me questions that make me feel like she's on my side, but also wants to know more about whatever I've just experienced.
Yeah.
Um, and then I feel like uh, when she does offer advice, she does it in a way that feels like she's my ally rather than my boss.
Yeah.
you know?
Those are great descriptions. And
Um,
so, and my guess is that sometimes you call her and you're just like pissed off and you're not in a place where you're a great conversationalist. And yet she
Yeah.
knows how to engage with you. She knows how to
Huh.
draw you out. And
Yeah.
you probably do the same thing for her. And this is
I
the
mean, I hope
explanation.
so. Yeah.
This is the explanation of what we do with someone who it who's bad at conversation. And let me just say, nobody, like, you're never mandated to have a conversation. Sometimes you get in the Uber and you just want to check your email. You don't want to have a conversation with the driver,
Mhm.
right? And that's totally fine. Nobody ever has to have a conversation if they don't want to. But if you're in a situation where you need to have this conversation or you want to have this conversation and this person is not a great conversationalist, what you do is you treat them the same way you treat Diana. Because there's probably sometimes that Diana calls
Mm.
you and she's distracted and she's pissed and she's is only
Mm.
half listening to what you're saying, and she's all worked up on this thing that's bothering her. And you know that, okay, what I have to do is I have to kind of like listen to her. I have to show her that I'm listening. I have to ask the questions that seem to appeal to what she's thinking about right now, rather than just the questions that are pro forma.
Yeah.
You treat Diana special, no matter how good or bad Diana is in that moment at conversation, because you care about her, because you're curious about her, because you want to connect with her.
But there's
And the
also,
truth of the matter is that we can do that with anyone.
I mean, but I feel like the thing that makes it different is that with Diana, it feels unconditional. It feels like I don't need to impress her, or like I don't need her to love me. She already does. I know that that's the case, right?
Yeah.
So, whereas I feel like a lot of the conversations that go awry are conditional, right? You're trying, there's something you're trying, one of you is trying to get out of the other, whether it's power, control, or information.
So I would say that that's probably the problem. That's
Mhm.
probably what's causing the issue. So if you think about it, like, what's the goal of a conversation? The goal of a conversation is not to agree with each other. It is not for you to get convinced that I'm right and you're wrong. It is not for you to convince me that you're right and I'm wrong. It is not for you to like me. It is not for you to think I'm smart. The goal of a conversation
Mhm.
is simply to understand what you are trying to tell me and to speak in such a way that you understand me. If we
Mhm.
understand each other and we walk away from that conversation thinking we don't agree about anything, that person is wrong, also I think they're a jerk, I don't like them, then it's okay. Like, the conversation's still been a success, because as long as I understood what you were trying to tell me and you understood what I wanted to say, then that conversation has been a success. So when we go into that conversation and we're saying, what I really want to do is I want to convince you to like me, or what I really want to do is convince you that I'm right and you're wrong, we're already going in basically screwing up the conversation.
Mhm.
When you call Diana, you aren't calling Diana to say, like, I really want to convince Diana that, like, I was a genius today or that I had the right
Mhm.
idea.
Mhm.
You're calling her to talk to her, to say, like, hey, here's how I saw the world. Here's what happened to me. This is how I feel about it. And for her to say, oh, that's interesting. Like, here's my perspective on it. Or something similar happened to me. If we bring that
Yeah.
same spirit of curiosity and goals, where our goal is simply to understand the other person and help them understand ourselves, then every conversation can be like that conversation with Diana. And
Mhm.
maybe they're not going to be as delightful as Diana is, and maybe
Mhm.
the conversation isn't going to go as well, but it is going to go a lot better. You're going to be able to connect with anyone that you want to.
So a lot of our conversations have turned to text, have turned to, electronic media. Um, are there tools that, like, do some of these same tools apply in a text conversation?
Absolutely.
And yeah, I mean, one of the things that I've noticed in the evolution of texting is that now it seems like there is, there's at least for me, like my texting etiquette is that if someone sends me a text, even if I don't respond with my own words, I will respond with a like or a thumbs up or something. And if I don't respond at all in any kind of way, that feels like also a choice, as opposed to, like, just kind of ignore, like, I don't know, it's sort of like, do you get the sense that, like, that is making us better conversationalists through text messaging, or is that just, another fad?
So what I would say is that the same things that make a verbal conversation go well is also true of other forms of conversation, with the caveat being that we have to recognize the strengths and weaknesses of each form of communication and
Hmm.
what the rules are for it. So let's use phone calls as an example. When phone calls first became popular about 80 years ago or 100 years ago, there were all these articles that appeared that said nobody is ever going to have a real conversation on over the telephone. Right? Because up to that point, all conversations had happened face to face. And experts said, look, if you can't see the other person, if you can't see their facial expressions, their gestures, you're never going to have a real conversation with them. And what's really interesting is that at that moment, they were exactly right. If you look at transcripts from early telephone calls, what you see is that people didn't know how to use the phone. They used them the same way that you would use telegraphs. They would call someone up and they would give them a grocery order, and then nobody knew how to have a back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
Because we hadn't learned how to use that technology. Now, by the time you and I were in middle school, we could have conversations for like 7 hours a night, right? And they were the most important conversations of our lives. We knew how to use phones. We learned how to use phones. And in fact, even today, when you use a phone, you speak in a different way without realizing it. We tend to over-enunciate our words when we're talking on the phone. Because because again, subconsciously we recognize that the other person can't see us. We tend to put about 20 to 25% more emotion into our voice when we're talking to someone on the phone than when we're talking face to face. We've learned the strengths and weaknesses of telephones, and we've learned how to adapt for them. When it comes to online communication, the same thing is happening. So I have kids who are teenagers. They have whole conversations that are just emojis. And as a parent, I can say like, that seems ridiculous. That doesn't seem like a rich conversation, until they decode them for me and they explain that for them, emojis is a form of emotional communication. And they use those emojis as signals of an emotional feeling. Now, that does not mean that having an emoji conversation is the same as having a phone conversation, is the same as talking face to face. But it does mean that each kind of communication has its own strengths and weaknesses. And you had mentioned Vivek Murthy before, and Surgeon General, saying, this epidemic of loneliness. And he's exactly right. One of the things that we know is that when we go on social media and we just watch other people on social media, it feels terrible. But when we go on social media and we have real conversations with other people, it can feel wonderful.
Yeah.
It's all about recognizing the rules that pertain to certain kinds of communication and then honoring and respecting them, as opposed to pretending like everything is the same, whether I'm texting you versus calling you versus emailing you.
Yeah. Well, for even more tips on how to unlock the secret language of communication, I recommend to my listeners to buy Charles Duhigg's book, Supercommunicators. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you about this and have this conversation. And I guess the one thing I'll ask you now is like, so do you put all these things into practice? Does like every day you come home have such wonderful conversations with your wife?
No. I mean, I tried to. I definitely tried. Although I will admit that like there's times at the dinner table that like I'll start monologuing and my wife is like, there's this book you might want to read about. But no, one of the things that my wife and I definitely do now is that like, when I come home and I start complaining about my day, she'll often say like, do you want me to help you come up with solutions, or do you just need to complain and like get this off your chest?
Yeah.
And actually I love it when she asks that, because I can say like, no, this isn't a big deal. Like, we don't have to solve this problem. I just want to like complain about my boss and what he did today. The more that we communicate about how we communicate, the better that communication tends to be. And so one of the things that I do try and do is talk a lot about what I'm trying to get across, because I think that helps us focus on how to do so in the way that brings us closer together.
Yeah. And we need that now more than ever. So Charles Duhigg, thank you so much for being on Inquiring Minds.
Thanks for having me on. And I hope your next conversation with Diana is wonderful.
It always will be. So that's it for another episode. Thanks for listening. And if you want to hear more, don't forget to subscribe. If you'd like to get an ad-free version of the show, consider supporting us at patreon.com/inquiringminds. I want to especially thank David Noel, Herring Chang, Yushi Lin, Jay Henry, Joel, and Charles Weil. Inquiring Minds is produced by Why Not Alchemy. I'm your host, Indre Viscontis. See you next time.
So